Hey, I'm producer Eden Eliah, and I'm here at EastWest Studios today to show you how I use lo-fi to make my track City Lights. So let's dive in and check it out. Usually when working in this genre, I like to start with the drums. That way I have an idea of how the song is going to fill out. I love to start with a 4/4 kick just to give me a groove. And then I'll add some claps as a backbeat and some hi-hats. I like to add some percussion to make a groove a little bit better. One technique I really like to use is I like to layer claps. I'll take one clap from a drum machine that's really punchy and dry, and I'll layer it with another clap, and when they come together, it sounds really good. As you can hear, the second clap is a lot more open and has a lot of claps put together. It's subtle, but it adds the right energy to the track. When I want to bring the energy up and add emphasis, I like to add a crash on the one. Another technique I really like to use is I like to take the toms and pitch them into the key of the song, and then I'll play them in a little bit of an off groove so they fit in with the melody. What's nice about it is it fills in the melody layers that the other elements don't do, and it's also rhythmic as well. It works really well for this genre. Another technique I really like to use is I like to layer open hats. You can use it to add emphasis to a section and make it feel different than the one before. Once I have the backbeat laid down, I like to fill it in with some pads or some chords to understand where we're going melodically with the song. In this case, I used the danger pluck from Lo-Fi. It's one of those sounds that have a full chord on one key. Now that I have my main melodic structure filled out, I can start adding elements. Something I really like to do is whenever there's a breakdown, I take the main sound and I filter it out a little bit and add some more elements to make it a little more mysterious. Another cool trick is you find a long sustaining note that's basically in the root key of the song, and you play it through an entire section leading into the next one. It just tends to add like an eeriness and a lot of energy in the background of the song. Now, while that's playing, the chords change on top of it, and it always works in every chord change, and it just is really pleasing to the ear. Once I have the melodic structure established, I like to figure out my bass line. For this genre, bass is really, really important, and it helps drive the song, and it's basically what holds the song together. The sound I used for that bass is called Deep Ghost, and it's one of the presets you'll find in Lo-Fi. Once we have the main bass line established, it's great to use it to build an intro. You just take the parts, you chop them up, and then you add a little bit of reverb and delay. As you can tell, it's just a sneak preview of what the actual bass line is, but it's great for making an intro. Another thing I really love to do is right before the real bass line comes in, I like to add a bass fill. It helps establish that something new is coming. I like to use the same bass I used on the intro to make a breakdown. That way it's something that's familiar and you've heard it before, but this time it's over a new piece of music. One thing I really love about lo-fi is its ability to make rhythmic leads that fit rhythmically with the song and melodically, and they sound amazing. There are tons of great lead sounds in lo-fi, and here's a couple I used for this track. When building a breakdown, I like to bring in new elements that you haven't heard before. This will help you feel like something new is happening. It's a new section, a new part of the song, and it sounds like this. One of my favorite categories of sounds in lo-fi is the vocals. They have all these mysterious, broken down, distorted, mangled vocals that just sound amazing in the track. Now that you've heard all the individual elements by themselves that I made using lo-fi, here's the full track. This is City Lights. Let's take a listen to my track, Last Summer. This track has 3 different sections. I'm going to break each section down piece by piece. I usually like to start with the drums. It helps set the tone for the track. This is the first section of the drums. I really love the snaps and claps in lo-fi. They sound amazing in any track. In this case, I added some reverb to the snap to make it feel more spaced out. I'm going to move on to the second part of the drums now. This part has a lot more energy and the groove really starts to build. I like to do this trick where I take the toms and I pitch them, and then I add them as rhythmic and melodic elements in a song. It really fills in the gaps. The hi-hat really starts to pick up in this section. It adds a lot of energy. I love how the 808 in this case adds a lot of grit and fills up a lot of the low end for this section. It sounds like this. For this third section, we return back to the original groove. I brought the snaps back and added a couple more rhythmic elements to fill in the space. I love how the snare has a delay on it that feeds off the rhythm. Another trick I like to do is I like to add flanger or phaser on the hi-hats to give it some more texture. The main pad sound in this track is called silky pads, and it's one of my favorites in lo-fi. There's plenty of amazing bass sounds in lo-fi. Here's the one I chose for this track. As you can hear, it's a bass full of character that fills up the entire low end. Lo-fi has a huge selection of amazing piano sounds. Here's the way I use some of them in this track. Funny story about this track. I originally started with a completely different bass idea, but I ended up pitching it up and it turned into the lead. Just goes to show how versatile these sounds are. You just change the octaves and all of a sudden you have a whole new part. Let's check it out. Let's check the same sound out at a lower octave. One trick I like to use is take a part that ends at a certain section and change the sound and sort of do something similar, like that bass part we just listened to, but this is done with plucks. Although they aren't exactly the same, you can tell that they kind of have a similar feel, and when one goes away, the other one comes in. Lo-fi is full of hybrid sounding guitar sounds that aren't exactly a guitar, but they aren't exactly something else, and you can't really put your finger on it. Sound incredible in any style of music. Sometimes you want a bass that just fills in the low end without getting in the way. Lo-fi is full of basses like that. Here's an example of one of them. You'll find plenty of amazing lead sounds in lo-fi. Here's an example of one I used on this track. Another trick I love to do is use the same sound in a different section, but I bring it in a different octave. So if it was playing one octave down last time, it's going to come in an octave up this time. You'll recognize this pad from the intro. Now that you've heard all the individual parts broken down, let's take a listen to my track, Last Summer. that's how I use lo-fi. I hope you learned something new today. If you want to learn more tips and tricks, hit the like and subscribe buttons. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time.